Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Lewis Too Much Analyzes Comics. We're continuing our question series, The Question by Denny O'Neil and Dennis Cowan. And we're doing issues 16 through 18 today. If you watched my last two videos, you saw me gushing over the stories that I analyzed there. And today will be no different. This video will be no different. I loved this story, except for one thing, but I'll get to that when I get to that. Other than that, let's get into the story. So the story opens with our good friend Izzy O'Toole, who, if you don't remember who he is, he's the police officer who was corrupt for years and years and years, and then the Question rescues him from a, not quite a mugging, but pretty much these guys that try and kill him. And from there, Izzy O'Toole decides to turn his life around and become a good cop, which is something that we're going to talk about a little bit later in the issue. And so anyways, so Izzy, he's trying to bust up a drug deal, and in the process, he beats up both the drug dealers and the police officers who are on the take, letting the drug deal go down. And so in the process of interrupting this drug deal, Izzy goes into this building, and we find out that somebody from the fire department who's parked outside of the building actually is part of this whole drug deal and goes around the building spreading gas, intending to set the building on fire so that they could kill Izzy O'Toole. But thankfully for Izzy, the Question shows up and kicks the guy through the windshield. So Izzy is safe, thankfully. From there, we go to Vic doing a newscast, and he essentially explains everything that I just explained, so we won't get into that too much. And after he's done, Myra shows up to talk to him, and she ends up talking to him about how because of the fact that her husband is a drunk and he's a terrible mayor, her campaign, she's running for mayor herself, her campaign is being harmed by the fact that her husband is a louse. And so Vic and her kind of do this little back and forth banter about how politics sucks. And it's funny because Vic and I actually have a very similar disposition in terms of politics. I'll pretty much read the exchange between Vic and Myra. So she ends up giving like a pre-prepared speech about why she's running for mayor, and she uses the example of what happened to Izzy as a reason for why she's running for mayor. And so Vic comes up to her after, and he ends up telling her, "Nice speech, Myra, but you always did have a nice way with an ad lib." And she says, "Ad lib, my delicate posterior. I knew your camera crew was coming, so I wrote that sucker out and memorized it." And he says, "All right, I'm disillusioned. You're just like all the rest, a shameless sham. Now, what brings you to station KBEL? Bad news, the party's national committee is probably going to refuse to endorse. They say I'm closely identified with my husband and mayor, Wesley Furman, and he's a disgrace to politics." And then Vic says, which is like saying that stink is a disgrace to garbage dumps. And she says, "Your low opinion of my new profession is widely known, Vic, and not appreciated just now." All right, so the point of me reading all that to you is to kind of get into why I personally have a very similar disposition as Vic, and also why this conversation is important in terms of what Denny O'Neil is trying to accomplish. So personally, I don't like politics. And the reason for that is that I feel like our current political system is essentially designed to weed out people that are actually interested in helping. And because of the fact that it's actually, just like Denny O'Neil presented, it was a couple of issues back when Myra has that nightmare where she's essentially like stripping in front of a group of people, and that's how she feels, right? As a politician, she feels as if she's being stripped bare in front of everybody. And I tend to feel that that is a perfect illustration of what our political system looks like. We essentially like tear down, and I'm going to get into, to what degree that's fair or not, but we essentially tear down politicians to the point that the only sort of person that's going to want to be in there, that's going to want to enter into that sort of an arena, is the sort of person that is a little bit of a narcissist, a little bit delusional, and is really power hungry and looking to impose their way of thinking on everybody else, and not really take into consideration what everybody else is telling them that they want them to accomplish, which ultimately is how a democracy is supposed to work. We're supposed to tell our politician, hey, look, this is what we need. Now you go and, essentially negotiate on our behalf to get it for us, right? But instead, the opposite happens. A politician will essentially get convinced in their own head, I have all the right ideas, and essentially whichever is the most charismatic and slickest, and oftentimes the slickest liar, is the one that essentially gets ahead. And essentially it's all basically all politicians kind of agree that this is the game that they're all playing, and so we all have to play the game as dirty as possible because that's really the only way to get elected, and so on and so forth. And personally, I'm a little bit disillusioned by that whole process, because I don't think that the best person to lead their community is ever going to be filtered out, or is ever going to, bubble up to the top based on that sort of a process, because the sort of person that would actually care about helping their community is not really going to be interested in going into that sort of an arena. And so you're basically weeding out the sorts of people that would actually be good at being politicians. And so, to a certain degree, my personal preference is that the government essentially just stay somewhat gridlocked at all times, and lets society kind of iron things out amongst ourselves. That's personally my preference. Now, what is Denny O'Neil doing here? He makes the good guy, the champion of the comic, have my personal opinion. Now, Denny O'Neil does not have that opinion at all. If you've ever listened to him in an interview, he's very pro, liberal policies. He's firmly a believer that he's a firm believer in government assistance for the needy and all of that kind of stuff. Basically your typical kind of 1960s, 1970s liberal sorts of policies, right? And so he's very obviously politically involved. And yet he writes this character, his main character, as somebody who has an opposing viewpoint to him. Why is this something that I want to talk about? Especially considering that, personally, I'm not on the same side of the aisle as Denny O'Neil in regards to that. It's because I really respect what Denny O'Neil has done here. He has taken a character, the main character of the story, and given him traits that he himself disagrees with. Now, he's trying to persuade people like me to give politicians a chance. And in reality, I'm sure that there are certain politicians out there who are actually trying to do what's right. Whether or not, they actually do, whether or not they actually accomplish their goals is another matter, because of the fact, that they're entering such a vicious arena. But anyways, what Denny O'Neil is trying to do here is convince people like me to be open-minded and give his perspective a chance. And he does that by creating a character that I can identify with, and then leading that character on a journey towards Denny O'Neil's viewpoint. And this is something that I think a lot of writers have lost sight of, because essentially what I see a lot in modern writing is the main characters, basically all the main characters, have the viewpoint of the author, and then all the villains have the opposite viewpoint as the author, and essentially the point of the story is just the heroes conquer and good triumphs, right? But the problem with that is, what if you are the person who identifies with the villain in the story? I'm not going to be persuaded to give your perspective a second look when you paint me as an automatic victim, or as an automatic villain, just because I don't agree with you, or just because I don't have the same perspective as you. And so ultimately all that you're doing is essentially polarizing different perspectives. So it's either you're on this side and you're the good guy, or you're on this side and you're the bad guy, and there's no convincing one way or the other. It's this like very rigid, almost like Calvinist, for those who are familiar, with essentially what Christian Calvinism is essentially this idea that God ordains everything, and that there are certain people who are elect and certain people who are not elect, and whoever is elect, God transforms them and makes them into the sorts of people that he wants them to be, and the not elect are people that are essentially destined for damnation. And so in a sense, like from a political perspective, it's a very Calvinistic sort of type of thinking, where like you have to be born or transformed at some point in your life to my way of thinking. I never have to convince you to think the way that I think. It just happens by some sort of miraculous occurrence, and until that moment comes for you, you are on the bad side. And personally, I don't really see that as something that's that sort of viewpoint as really all that healthy. In terms of like a Christian who's a Calvinist, at the very least, a Christian who's a Calvinist starts off with the viewpoint that they were a sinner, and God by his mercy rescued them out of that sinful state, and so they're intended to be humble about the fact that they're elect. So at least that's kind of like wired into the philosophy. But in the case of like political disagreements, there's no humility wired into that whole process. It's, look, I have the perfect and I have the best viewpoint, and if you don't have that same viewpoint with me, you're evil until you agree with me, and I have absolutely no responsibility to making you agree with me. You just have to come to that conclusion again by some sort of miraculous happenstance. And personally, I don't see how we're supposed to move forward as a community, as a society, as long as we're going to think of anybody that disagrees with us in that light. But, what do I know? Let's keep going. And, I should point out, what do 1960s, 1970s, 1980s liberals know? Because apparently this used to be their viewpoint, right? Which is, hey, if we want to persuade people, we should actually like connect with them and interact with them and think of them as good people that just haven't been shown the light yet, maybe something to think about. But all right, so anyways, back to the question. So Myra, she's like, hey, your viewpoint on politics, it's not really helpful right now. I'm actually a good person that's actually trying to run for mayor to actually accomplish something. I'm actually trying to fix the city. Could you like give me an encouraging word or help a sister out in some way? And so he thinks, hey, wait a minute. Why don't you get endorsed by somebody that the community respects? Who is that person that the community respects? Well, there's only one person available, and that is Izzy O'Toole. So the question shows up at Izzy's house, and he essentially ends up asking Izzy if he's willing to endorse Myra on television to lend some of his credibility over to Myra, and Izzy ends up agreeing. Now, in the course of that, they end up having a discussion about Izzy's transformation from a bad cop to a good cop. And the question asks him, hey, be level with me. Why did you make that transition? Was it just because I saved you that day? And Izzy ends up telling him, maybe that's part of it. Or maybe it's that I had been a bad cop for so long, and it kind of led him down a certain sort of lifestyle. And all of a sudden he realized, hey man, if I'm not happy being this, then I have to be something else. And he thinks to himself, well, what are my options if I'm going to change? And the only option left to me is to be a good and noble cop. So I might as well try that. I'm dissatisfied with life being bad. let's try being good for a little while and see if it works out. And the question is like, oh, well, at the very least, you had some reason to become good. That's something, again, for all of us to think about. Like, if you're living a lifestyle that you're not happy with, and, if you're living a lifestyle that you're not happy with, and you're a pillar of your community and providing food to the needy and funding charities and all of that kind of stuff, just keep doing that. We would all appreciate it. But if you're somebody who is a pariah to your community, if you're a criminal, if you're somebody who's stealing and lying and all of that kind of stuff, and you're not happy with your life, maybe try telling the truth. Maybe try being honest. Maybe try not, stealing and all of that good stuff. Maybe try contributing to your community rather than taking from your community. It's worth a shot, right? All right. So anyways, that's what happens with Izzy. And from there, we're introduced to the antagonists of the story. And this is the one thing that I said that I didn't like about the story. This is purely a personal thing. It has no objective reason behind it. I have no idea why this is the case. But for some reason, I don't like comic book villains that are like modern people trapped in the Old West, or that think that they're still in the Old West. I have no idea why. Like, in my head, it just seems so outlandish and stupid, which I know I'm talking about a medium where a scientist can turn into an octopus, he doesn't turn into an octopus, but he's a man with 8 mechanical arms. For some reason, I have no idea if it's just that I'm like more science. I have no idea what it is. I never connect with characters like that, like in Spider-Man, the Enforcers. I always hate those characters that, they're modern cowboys. I don't know. Like, to me, it just... I'm sure that there's people out there too, but for me, it just seems so ridiculous that you're living in like the middle of a modern city and you somehow believe that you're still in the Old West. But whatever. So those are the two villains. It's these two guys. They call themselves Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, based on the old movie, which unfortunately I've never seen. I assume if anybody ever does watch these videos, that I'll get a comment based on that telling me to watch it, and so I will watch it one day. I just have never come across it and had the time. But anyways, so we're introduced to these two villains, who they one of them, I believe it's Butch. He thinks that he is the like some kind of descendant of the original Butch Cassidy, and so he ends up paying this other guy who's like a complete nut job to call himself Sundance, and together they form kind of like a little crime syndicate. They sell weapons to terrorists in the Middle East and in other places, and so that's essentially their criminal empire. And so they're trying to decide where they're going to set up shop next. They're originally from Seattle, and they end up finding Hub City and saying like, hey, this is a place that's overrun with crime. There's no good people there. We can set up shop there. Nobody's gonna bother us. Nobody's gonna notice who we are. And so they decide to move to Hub City. But before they move there, they recognize that there is one man in Hub City who is a pillar of virtue. And that man is Izzy O'Toole. And so they need to get rid of this guy before they move in. Now, I forgot to mention this before, but the question when he was talking to Izzy O'Toole, he tells Izzy, look, man, if you're going to endorse Myra, you got to stay alive for me, buddy, because this is really important that you endorse her. And so Izzy ends up saying, I'm going to go down to my basement and fetch an old friend that I think is going to help me out with that, right? So these guys now, they intend to kill Izzy. And as I said, the guy that's playing Sundance, he's a bit of a nut job. And so, this is awesome, man. This is pure comics right here, and I love it to death. So instead of like, finding the guy and assassinating him quietly, he rides this helicopter to Izzy's apartment building and blows up the entire apartment building instead of just killing the guy. in a much more subtle fashion. Unfortunately for that guy, Izzy makes it out of the explosion, so he survives, and this pisses the guy off. He's upset about the fact that Izzy has escaped, and so he's planning to do Izzy in a different way. In the meantime, Izzy, he makes his way, or he's pretty much in the hospital, because he was almost blown up, and Vic ends up telling him, hey, it's time, we need you to come and do that endorsement. And so Izzy is leaving the hospital, and as he's leaving the hospital, this very interesting thing happens, which is some police officers who are dirty cops, because everybody in Hub City is a dirty cop, all the cops are dirty, actually show up to the hospital and tell Izzy, hey man, it's messed up what they did to you. We're your brothers in arms, and regardless of the fact that you're clean now and we're still dirty, you're still our brother, and we're gonna look out for you, and we recognize that it's messed up what happened to you. And so what's really cool about that is that it touches upon this idea that I find very attractive. Whether or not it works 100%, I doubt that it does, but I find it attractive, and so I want to talk about it really quick. The idea that a good man can infiltrate a bad place, and through his a good man or a woman, by the way, and through their goodness, they can actually influence the bad place to become a better place. Even if some people are not instantaneously transformed by that goodness, and some of them might even be opposed to that goodness, over time, that goodness can actually spread out. And goodness has a way of being convincing, because ultimately, I shouldn't say that all of us want to be good, because I don't actually think that that's true, but I think the majority of us want to be good and want to do things that are right. And so even if we're not doing it, I think a lot of times the reason that we don't do good is because it's much easier to do bad. And I think that a lot of times we look out into society and we see, oh, it's so terrible out there. The only way to get ahead is by being bad, which is essentially what's happening to these cops. And so it, again, it's kind of just the default is it's easier to do what's bad than it is to do what's good. But when somebody is an exemplar, is standing up for what's right, and things, are kind of working out for him or her, then that person shows the rest of us, hey, it's possible to do things right. And, like people like MLK, Gandhi, all those, great figures in history that, that they actually do what's right, and they can like transform. I mean, in the case of both of those men, they'd like transformed entire countries by their virtue. So that's pretty cool. It's the potency of virtue. So yeah, something again to consider. So anyways, from there, Izzy, he makes his way to the station, and he gives his endorsement of Myra, which I love this endorsement. He said, this is pretty much what he says. I'll make this short and sweet. They asked me to say something about this Myra Furman lady that's running for mayor. Well, here it is. She's straight. She's okay. I'm voting for her. And he's smoking a cigarette while he says it, like a truly virtuous man. But actually, he makes the point because Vic compliments him on his virtue, and he's like, dude, I don't like people talking about me being virtuous, because of the fact that he has lived so much of his life not virtuously, which is, it's amazing. To me, that's actually the stepping stone to virtue. It's a necessary stepping stone to virtue, is humility, recognizing all the bad things that you've done in the past, all the mistakes that you've made in the past, and then accepting the fact that you've made those mistakes and that you're going to change, and now you can progress towards goodness. And there's a pathway to that, which, by the way, is what the rest of this story is about, and so we'll get to that when we get to that. All right, but anyways, so from here, Vic ends up learning, or Vic ends up trying to find out who it was that blew up Izzy's building as the question. And so he finds out that it was a maintenance man that had tipped off the guys. And he goes and he interrogates the guy. You know, we'll kind of breeze over that because there's a lot of stories still to get to. And he ends up finding out from the maintenance guy that he's interrogating that not only was it him that told the bad guys, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, but he also told them where Izzy is staying now. So the question rushes over to save him, and when he gets there, he ends up he ends up trying to save Izzy, but all of those dirty cops that had been following Izzy around see the question, and they think that he's a criminal, and so they start fighting with him. And so while they're fighting with the question, Izzy ends up going up to his room, and when he gets into his room, Sundance is waiting for him there, and we find out that Sundance has this propensity, which comes into play later, for good old-fashioned Western duels where, you know, we both draw at the same time and we see who's faster, and he's always faster. And so he ends up shooting Izzy in the chest, and after he shoots Izzy in the chest, the question comes in, beats up Sundance, and he thinks Izzy is dead, but turns out that Izzy was wearing a bulletproof vest. And he also reveals that that's actually what he was looking for when the helicopter came to bomb his apartment building. He was in the basement looking for his bulletproof vest, and so the vest not only saved him once, it saved him twice. And so from there, Sundance is put in jail, and that's where the next issue actually opens with this gentleman right here, who is in a nursing home. He's a little bit kooky, and he says that there's some kind of coming apocalypse, that an angel is bringing the apocalypse, and this nurse is trying to argue with him about how he needs to come back inside. And so that's going to play into the story a little bit in just a little bit here. So Sundance, he's in jail, and Butch, his friend here, ends up showing up pretending to be his lawyer. He gets into the prison by smuggling in a plastic gun, and he ends up giving it to Sundance, and Sundance shoots the guards, and they actually end up escaping. And so Vic ends up chasing after the guy, and this is the second time that Vic does this in the series, where he jumps and grabs on to a helicopter, and which is completely insane. And you gotta respect the guy for doing that. But as they're hovering over the city, Vic ends up slipping, and he asks himself this question, which is an excellent question to ask ourselves sometimes. He says, at a time like this, a man's got to ask himself, what am I doing here, and why on earth am I doing it? And, that's a question that we should ask ourselves sometimes. Maybe, we're in a situation that we're miserable in, and we got to ask ourselves the question, what on earth am I doing here, and why am I doing it? Because it's very important to understand why we're doing the things that we're doing, and it's very important to ask what we're doing here when we're in a situation that we don't want to be in. Why did we get here? How did we get here? Maybe it was because we made some bad choices along the way. And in the case of Vic, he made the bad choice of jumping onto a helicopter with no plan as to how to climb up. So unfortunately for him, he drops down from the sky, and that gentleman that we had talked about earlier, who was expecting an angel to come down from heaven, identifies Vic as that angel, and then blam! The poor guy dies, unfortunately. But we discover that he was old, and that he had like 50 diseases, and he was in a lot of pain, and so he was actually kind of, in a sense, like wanting to die. He wanted to be put out of his misery, and he ends up sacrificing his life for Vic's, which is kind of cool in stories sometimes, like characters that are essentially designed to sacrifice themselves for the sake of the main character. And I think that there's a lesson to be learned in that, like, if there is a greater good that we're serving. There comes a time, right, where your responsibility to the greater good is to actually lay down your life for the sake of maybe somebody else that is going to continue on with the greater good. Or you know, and to a more limited degree, maybe you don't have to lay down your life, but maybe you need to diminish so that this other person can increase, because maybe they're the ones that are going to take on the burden of responsibility for carrying forth that greater good. And maybe you had your time in the spotlight, and but now it's time to transition away. And so kind of this whole story is about this pathway to the greater good. So we're gonna get to that here in a second, because Vic, he feels really terrible about the fact that this poor old man had to die to rescue him. And so he's essentially talking with Tot while he's punching this punching bag, and he keeps punching it, and he's really upset about the fact that this has happened, and he's kind of giving into his rage. And Tot actually tells him, hey man, you're starting to sound like the old Vic, the Vic from before your transformation, from before your encounter with Richard Dragon. And Vic is kind of telling him, like, look man, I don't know what to tell you, but that's just how I feel right now. I'm getting, you know, like, I'm just filled with rage. And Todd's like, look, why don't you go and meditate? Yeah, I haven't seen you meditating in a while. Maybe that's why you're so upset. And Vic just says, look, you know, I don't have time for that. I need to go and track down these criminals that tried to kill Izzy, and that killed those security guards and essentially escaped. And so he puts on these Zumba pants and goes forth to Seattle, which is where the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are from. And so he ends up getting on a plane so that he can go to Seattle. And in the airport, he buys the comic book, The Watchmen. And so on the plane, he ends up reading The Watchmen, and he identifies that Rorschach and him seem to have similarities. Now, there's a reason for that, and there's a message that Denny O'Neil is trying to get across here, which is, well, I'll get to the message in a second, but the reason that there's a connection between the question and Rorschach is that years ago, Charlton Comics had owned the rights to the question because that's the comic company that Steve Ditko created the question for. Years later, DC bought Charlton Comics and bought all the superheroes that were a part of Charlton Comics. And they were actually trying to figure out what to do with these different heroes. And they initially had pitched Alan Moore if he wanted to do a story with the Charlton heroes. And Alan Moore decided that he did want to, but once he started crafting the story, which ended up becoming Watchmen, he realized that he was going to kill a whole bunch of the characters. And so I forget if it was him or DC that decided to kind of just use pastiches of the characters and instead of the characters themselves, so that way they could use the characters for their own series, which is what they ended up doing here with the question. And so Rorschach is actually the pastiche of the question, and it's Alan Moore's interpretation of what Steve Ditko had in mind when he created the question. And then this is Denny O'Neil's version of what, well, it's not what he thought Steve Ditko had in mind. It's actually him taking Steve Ditko's creation and then transforming him into something else, something that grows beyond the Steve Ditko's philosophy, since Denny O'Neil doesn't agree with that philosophy. And so Vic ends up reading Watchmen and reading about Rorschach, and he ends up thinking that Rorschach, he's a little bit bigoted, but otherwise he's actually like a really cool character. And he starts actually thinking to himself, man, I wonder if Tot can actually make my mask to be like Rorschach's mask. And he starts kind of identifying with Rorschach and thinking that Rorschach's methods might be the best methods, because Rorschach just charges into situations. You know, he's very firm in his principles, and he's very tough. He has, in fact, I think that this might be something that Denny's getting at here. I'm not sure, but Rorschach has kind of like a cowboy mentality, right? Like, there's right and there's wrong, there's black and there's white, and And pretty much when you're in the right, you have to charge ahead, and and goodness will prevail no matter what. That's kind of Rorschach's philosophy, and or that's kind of like the cowboy philosophy. And so I don't know if that was the idea that Denny was playing against by making the villains cowboy type villains. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but anyways, that's what ends up happening with Vic. And so he starts identifying with Rorschach, right? So once he gets to Seattle, he has this encounter at a bar with this gentleman who tells him that he knows him, but as becomes very obvious after the guy gets Vic drunk, the guy attacks Vic, and Vic and him start fighting, and Vic almost ends up getting beat up by the guy because of the fact that he's drunk, but because of his training, he's able to overcome the guy, beat him up. And so he becomes the question, and then after he recovers from being drunk, he tracks the guy down and realizes, that more than likely what happened was this guy actually works for the criminals. The criminals know Vic from Hub City, especially they know Vic as the guy that jumped on their helicopter. And so, this guy was in some way associated with the killers. And so he ends up tracking the guys down. So he goes to their house, or he goes to the guy's house. And when he gets there, as the question, he thinks to himself, what should I do? Should I wait outside patiently until the guy goes out and then I can follow him to wherever it is that he goes? Or should I break into the guy's house and beat the guy up and make him tell me what I want to know? And he thinks to himself, what would Rorschach do? Rorschach would go into the guy's house and he'd beat him up and torture him until he gives me the information. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be like Rorschach. And so he goes into the house and he does just that. And he's torturing the guy, about to get the information, when from behind somebody hits the question over the head with a gun. And he realizes that because he went in so rashly, he wasn't thinking clearly, and he ended up paying for it. So those guys, the two bad guys now, they end up calling Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, telling them that, hey, this guy with no face is in my house. And they're like, oh, that's the guy with no face that is from Hub City. Take him out to the middle of the woods and kill him out there. All right. So they end up taking the question out to the middle of the woods, and they're about to kill him. And they ask him, do you have any last words? And his last words are, yeah, Rorschach sucks. So this is where I'm going to get into what I think that the messaging is for this, especially because of the next issue that we're going to get into here in just a minute, which is one day I am going to do my own or an analysis of Watchmen, provided that I feel that this is going well as a channel. But I'm part of the reason that I started with the question. Part of the reason is because I love the question. I think it's awesome. But another reason is because it's a somewhat obscure story, and I kind of want to build up to some of those more like perennial comic stories like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, and things like that. I want to figure out what I'm doing before I actually get to those kinds of stories, right? And so anyway, so I don't want to say everything that I think about Rorschach right now, but I do want to say a little bit of what I think Denny O'Neil is trying to get at here, right? Which is that Rorschach is this very hard, rigidly principled sort of guy. He's very obviously, like, if you listen to anything that Alan Moore talks about, he's a stand-in for like hard right-wing political perspectives, and so both Alan Moore and Denny O'Neil are both of the more liberal variety, or of the more liberal persuasion, and so the point that Denny O'Neil is making here is that Rorschach's way of doing things has a certain charm to it, a certain appeal to it, but that ultimately you end up paying for it in the long run because of the fact that it's so rigid, and it's so like charged forth without much thought put into the situation. Again, it's very much like if this is good, then it's good, and you just have to fight for it, and to hell with the casualties in the middle. There's no thinking that needs to occur. When something is right, you just do it, and that's that, right? And I think that the point that Denny's making here is which again is kind of like what Steve Ditko's original idea for the question is that way of thinking is appealing. It's appealing. There's something inside of us, right, that like is attracted to that sort of perspective, that like if something is good, you just charge ahead and who cares about who gets hurt in the process, right? Because we're doing what's right. That there's a certain sort of appeal to that, but that ultimately that's not the pathway towards anything good happening, because essentially what you do is you're so tunnel visioned that you can't see the peripheries, which is essentially what happens to the question here. He can't see the peripheries, and so he gets attacked from behind. And so the point that Denny is making here is put away those kind of like childish cowboy virtues and progress to this more Zen-like. It's, you got to take your time, make your decisions carefully, be cautious about things. Don't charge forward because you don't know how many casualties you're going to leave behind when you do that. That sort of a mentality. And so I think that that's the point that Denny's making here, right? When he's contrasting the Vic Sage that he's created versus the Rorschach that Alan Moore created. Now, the question is about to be killed when all of a sudden these arrows shoot through the hands of the two would-be assassins, and it's revealed that the Green Arrow has been tailing them all along. The Green Arrow, for those who don't know, is I don't know if this is fair, but I mean, he's essentially a Denny O'Neil stand-in. Green Arrow pretty much is like Denny O'Neil picturing himself as like a super awesome superhero, which is fine, by the way, because I love Denny O'Neil so much. I don't mind that much. And so Green Arrow, he has all of Denny O'Neil's platitudes worked into him, and a lot of Denny O'Neil's ideas wired into him. And again, because I love Denny, I'm okay with it. Typically, you don't want to do that as a writer because you're let's be honest, most of us are not that interesting. And so if you're going to write characters, you want to write characters that are interesting. And so if you're not interesting, you probably don't want to put characters that are your stand-ins into a book. Also, you fall into the danger when you do that of committing a bunch of the sins that I talked about earlier in the video, which is that you make yourself and all your friends the heroes of the story, and all of your enemies the bad guys of the story. And then ultimately what you end up doing is essentially having the same exact worldview as Rorschach, where everything is black and white, and if this is the good way of doing things, then you just got to charge ahead. And so that's not good. Now, in the case of Denny O'Neil and Green Arrow, I don't actually agree with a bunch of things that Denny O'Neil or Green Arrow believe in from a political perspective, but I don't mind the fact that they believe those things, and I think that I do agree with some of the things that they think. So I won't get into the specifics, but anyways, well, I pretty much do get into the specifics as I talk through these videos. Some of the things that I agree with and don't agree with. I very much agree with the philosophy that Denny O'Neil lives by, and I think it's very noble. And particularly in terms of like viewing your enemies as not evil, but maybe misguided, and needing more clarity or information, or needing patience, or maybe they're just not going to change, and maybe we just have to accept the fact that we have differences of opinions on things, and maybe I might be wrong, and so that might be something that I need to take into consideration. And so I have a lot of respect for that sort of viewpoint, and I have a lot of respect if that's what he thinks that politicians should be like, a little bit more. So in terms of his politics, if that's what he thinks politicians should be like, then I agree with him on that. So, all right, let's move on. So Green Arrow shows up and saves the question. And he ends up revealing that he was actually tracking down those criminals, and the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, because of the fact that they sell weapons to terrorists, and those terrorists end up killing children, innocents, older people, basically people that are, helpless, essentially, is what what Green Arrow is concerned about. And so, he actually kind of like gets mad at the question, because he's like, dude, like, you charged in like Galahad like a freaking clown, and you ruined the whole thing. I ended up having to jump into the tail of the pickup truck and or in the bed of the pickup truck and ride in the back, even though by now it's snowing really bad, which is something that plays into the story, which is really, actually, that's something that I gotta compliment Denny on as a writer, is that like he like starts ramping up the tension by making it snow, and it really adds to the atmosphere of the rest of the story. So anyways, he after he castigates the question actually acknowledges the fact that he's done bad and that what he did was stupid, but since Green Arrow doesn't know who he is, he pretty much leaves the question tied up, and so they put the two men in the flatbed of the truck, and the question and Green Arrow go in the front, and Green Arrow starts driving towards where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are, and that gives the question and Green Arrow an excuse to talk about The Art of War by Sun Tzu, which I have never read, but I should read it, because as I'm reading this, it sounds super cool. And man, I gotta tell you that I love the banter between the question and Green Arrow here. It's it's pretty much just an excuse for Denny O'Neil to kind of like have two sides of a, it's not even really two sides of a debate, because ultimately both of them kind of agree with each other, but the question essentially ends up making this point that he has had to learn the same lessons over and over and over, and he's beating himself up for that, and he ends up convincing Green Arrow finally to release him from his bonds by telling him, look, something that I learned from Richard Dragon is that there's two sorts of people in the world. There's the enlightened, and there's those on the path to enlightenment, and so ultimately all of us are on that path to enlightenment. I'm one of those people. I'm still on the path. I haven't been enlightened yet, but I'm trying to get there. And Green Arrow ends up kind of commiserating with him and saying, you know what, I'm in the same boat as you. And so because they connect on that, Green Arrow ends up freeing him and agreeing to work together with him. And I highly, if you haven't read these issues, I highly recommend them. I'm not going to read the banter between them, but the banter between them is awesome. I love it. Anyway, so the question ends up having this idea that they should shake down the guys and make them tell Green Arrow in the question the password to get into the base where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid are. It's not really a base. It's like a compound kind of place where there's, security and guard posts and dogs and all that kind of stuff. And so basically what they do is they threaten to leave the guys out in the snow and the cold and drive away. And so the guys end up agreeing to give Green Arrow and the question the password. In the meantime, we're taken over to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, who are essentially planning to kill their henchmen because they don't want any trace of them left behind, and they're trying to escape because they realize that, the question is after them, and so, if the question is after them, who knows who else might be after them, and so they're planning to escape, and so when the question and Green Arrow end up getting to the place, Green Arrow gives them the password, the car pulls into the compound, and Sundance, with a bazooka, this guy, he loves blowing stuff up, man, so he fires a bazooka at the truck, blowing it up. Now, fortunately, Green Arrow and the Question, they're too smart, and so they had actually gotten out of the truck before they let the truck into the compound. They had put like a brick on the gas pedal so that the truck would go in. The truck exploded. Meanwhile, the Question and Green Arrow are outside. Green Arrow takes down all the lights in the compound, and that allows for the Question and Green Arrow to get in. Now, in the meantime, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, they're trying to escape via helicopter, but the pilot doesn't want to leave because of the fact that it's snowing so bad now. It's getting dangerous, and so he doesn't want to. And he has this very tense exchange with Sundance, who, as I've mentioned, is kind of a wacko, because Sundance is like, look, we got to get out of here, get in that plane, or get in that plane, pretty much. And the pilot keeps arguing with him back and forth, and so eventually Sundance is like, you know what, man, give this guy a gun right now. And he tells Butch, give this guy a gun right now. And so the helicopter pilot is pretty much like, I don't, what am I supposed to do with this gun? I'm not going to do anything with it. Look, man, I'm just being honest with you. We can't fly in this weather. It's too dangerous. And Sundance tells him, pull your gun. And the guy's like, I'm not going to pull the gun. And so Sundance ends up shooting his coffee cup, and he's like, pull your gun. And the helicopter pilot's like, dude, I have kids, man. Like, please think about my kids. I can't risk my life. And Sundance ends up shooting a picture of the guy's kids. And so finally the helicopter pilot says, all right, man, I'll fly you wherever you need me to fly you. Let's go. And at that point, Sundance is like, no, I don't want you to fly me at this point. You piss me off. I want to kill you. Draw your gun, or I'm going to kill you without you drawing the gun. And so the helicopter pilot's like, dude, like, I'll do whatever it is that you want. And he's like, no. And so he ends up having a stare down with the guy. They have a draw. Sundance shoots him right in the face. And at that point, Butch is like, dude, you killed our helicopter pilot. How are we supposed to fly out of here? And Sundance is like, don't worry about it. I'm gonna figure it out. I'll figure out how to fly this helicopter. Don't worry about it. And so just as they're about to fly off in the helicopter, the Question and Green Arrow, who had earlier commandeered some what the heck are these things called? The little snowmobiles, whatever. They had commandeered those from some thugs. They drive the snowmobiles into the helicopter. The helicopter comes crashing down, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, they get out. Sundance, who always draws fastest, goes to draw his gun, but Green Arrow, like the Denny O'Neil stand-in that he is, he draws the arrow first, and he ends up shooting Sundance in the arm. And so the Question and Green Arrow disarm Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It's snowing too bad for them to go anywhere, so they actually end up going back to the compound with all the thugs. And so they actually, there's something that Green Arrow points out earlier, and it's one of the main kind of themes or ideas in the last issue, is Green Arrow and the Question, before they're going to go into the compound, they end up talking to those thugs that they had fought with, and they end up telling them, like, look, we'll come back for you once we've beat up your bosses. And the Question tells him, you could just leave them out here and they'd die. And Green Arrow's like, I've killed a man before. He was a bad man, and I killed him, but it felt terrible, and I'll never do it again. And so, as we talked about earlier, Green Arrow had made the point that people are valuable. And, he was talking specifically about the helpless, that's actually what motivates him to do this superheroing thing. And that's why he was after Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He doesn't like the idea of innocents being harmed. And so, the Question and Green Arrow end up taking the criminals into the compound. And the issue closes with this really kind of beautiful caption, honestly. It says, but for now, as ice glazes, The mountains and the wind screams, and snow whips and eddies, and cold settles over the land. 6 men huddle in a small circle of warmth and talk all the night long of good and evil. And so it's essentially the question, and Green Arrow essentially trying to convince these guys that human beings are valuable, and you know, whether or not they actually listen to them is another story, but I guess they're in no position to to disagree. So, and that's how the issue closes. And I think I think ultimately that, you know, some of the themes that Denny's playing with here are the idea of a man, number one, you know, on the pathway to enlightenment, and how bumpy that path is. The question makes this point at some point in the story, that he's upset at himself that he has to keep relearning the same lessons over and over again, and he's angry at himself for that. But the point being that, you know, the pathway to enlightenment, right, is a rocky road. Like biblically, there's this proverb that says, you know, the righteous man stumbles 7 times and gets up 8. But the wicked man essentially like falls and never gets up. So it's something, I'm paraphrasing very loosely, but it's something to that effect, right? Is, you know, the righteous man is somebody that learns from his mistakes and is able to move past his mistakes, versus the wicked man that, you know, actually just makes a mistake and is like, well, whatever, I'm down here anyways, I might as well lick dust, right? And so I think that that's part of the idea there, and that the pathway, that the ultimate end goal, right, is that you become the sort of person that actually cares about all human beings. That's, you know, from a Buddhist perspective, that's enlightenment. In Christianity, that's essentially like the foundational element of Christianity, is that all men are created in the image of God, and that God loves all people. And so, you know, no matter who you are, you're a valuable member of society. You're a valuable creature, and, you know, we have to all treat each other as if that is the case. And I think that ultimately that's the message that Denny's getting at, is that human being, which is essentially the foundation of humanism. So if you consider yourself a humanist, that's the foundation of humanism, is that all human beings matter. Rich, poor, you know, no matter your skin color, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, whatever, everyone matters. And so that's, you know, that's kind of like the rock solid, that's like the rock foundation of all the ethical philosophies that are amongst our country right now. And so that's the wisdom that Denny O'Neil's trying to impart to us. And so tune in next time for my next video, where I continue to analyze the question. I love everybody that stuck around this far. I really appreciate you all listening. Thank you so much. Have a good day.